Welcome back, AP World Warriors. Today we're going to talk about early human history and river valley civilizations. We have a couple of goals to achieve, a roadmap if you will. You don't need to write these down, but just to let you know what we're looking at today. We're going to try to learn how humans change from hunter-gatherer groups to settled societies. We're going to look at the impact of settled societies on humanity. And then we're going to identify and talk about the earliest river valley civilizations, which end up being precursors to the civilizations that we live in today, and that ones in the past that we're going to study. We probably won't get to that fourth objective there, but if you do know, I would love for you to tell me. So the first thing we're going to talk about is something called the out of Africa theory, which is widely accepted by historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and the like. What this states is that humanity actually starts in Africa. So if you see this little number 1, we start here. As environmental patterns, as weather changes, gets a little bit better, what you're going to see is that people are going to migrate. So for instance, they come up here to the Middle East next. Then they're going to actually go over to Oceania, down into Australia. Important to note, the level of the water was actually lower, so they were using hollowed out, like smaller boats and things to get there. At the same time, you've actually got people going over here into Europe. And then we'll go up into Asia, cross over a frozen land bridge where the Bering Strait is between Russia and Alaska, come into North America, and go all the way down to South America. So this is how we, over time, not all at once, but migrate and populate all of these different regions. We had to start somewhere, however, and we're going to start in the Stone Age, the Paleolithic. There are 3 different parts to the Stone Age. This is the first one. The Paleolithic means Old Stone Age, so paleo meaning old, and it started 2 million years ago and ended 12,000 years ago. So it's one of like the longest periods of time here. Some of the characteristics, you have simple tool use, things like stones, things like sticks that are used as different types of maybe weapons or for chopping, that sort of thing. If you look down here, you can see, we're not just using rocks, but we're actually fashioning them into something like a hand axe. We also are nomadic, which means that we follow our food source. We migrate from place to place. Another way to talk about that is calling us hunter-gatherers. So we're not going to grow our food, but we're going to search for it, right? We're going to gather food. Could be different plants, could be different types of fruit. We're going to look for good sources of water. We might follow animals and hunt them. So this is a highly mobile group of people, actually several small groups of people going from place to place. Because of that, population growth is slow. It's very difficult to take a large group of people with you as you move about. I don't know if you've ever been on a vacation, but if you're trying to hike through the woods, it's a lot easier with 3 people versus having 10,000. So population growth is going to be slow. You have to be able to feed everybody. They also have complex languages and development of culture. You can actually see these giant paintings, these cave paintings in France. Migration patterns start to emerge, just as we saw in the previous slide, due to environmental changes and also just due to following our own food source. The next part of the Stone Age is called the Mesolithic. Meso meaning middle, so this is the Middle Stone Age. This one started 12,000 years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. During the Mesolithic, there is climate change. We have the last great ice age actually ending, and so the weather gets a little bit better, living conditions improve, it might be easier to find food and water, and so people start to migrate even more. Human progress also accelerates as well. Our tools and weapons become much more sophisticated. They have much more specialized uses. They're mostly still stone, however. And we start food storage, where we're not necessarily growing it, but we collect more. We collect more food and we keep it so that we don't have to go out as often. You also have animal domestication, which you actually see in part of the Paleolithic anyway. The dog is going to be first. And population growth will accelerate because, well, you don't have as much stability as you do perhaps with a farm crop. You do have food storage where you're keeping a little bit extra, and so now you can maybe have to is something called the New Age or the Neolithic. The Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age is really important because it contains something called the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution is when agriculture begins. Agriculture begins about 10,000 years ago in this place called the Fertile Crescent, which kind of looks like a crescent shape, almost like the style of crescent rolls that I always made at Thanksgiving. Never perfect, always looking weird. But if you'll notice, you've got some rivers here, you've got extremely fertile land, and so this idea of agriculture is not going to happen all over the world for a while. It's going to spread slowly. But the idea is, well, why don't we just not, why don't, if we're storing food, why don't we replant it? Why don't we make our own food? Why don't we domesticate plants as well as animals? And so you'll start to see early examples like slash and burn farming, where you're trying to keep the land, the ground to have a lot of nutrients. So you slash and burn the crops when they're done, or to clear fields in order to plant more. And then you have further domestication of animals as well as plants. You have horses, dogs, goats, pigs, sheep, camels, which we'll talk about, very useful actually in the desert for trade. Because of this, because you now have crops, your population is going to increase. You can now support a large group of people because you're not looking for food all the time. And also, people start to live around where the food is. So people start to build permanent settlements, like Çatalhöyük, which was located in Turkey. What this will bring us to are early civilizations. So you have settlements like Çatalhöyük, and what's going to actually happen is that instead of just settling, we're going to see culture change. We're going to see the way in which people live in groups change into something that we don't just call permanent settlements, but actually we call civilizations. We have four ancient river valley civilizations we're going to talk about. You've got the Egypt, which is the Nile River Valley. You've got Mesopotamia, which is Tigris and Euphrates. India, and then we've got one in China, the Yellow River. So before we get to those, it's just kind of important to know how the Stone Age actually ends. We've got something called the Bronze Age, which starts about 6,000 years ago, once we started getting those settlements. During the Bronze Age, we have something called metallurgy. Metallurgy ends the Stone Age because you can think of it this way, we're now using metal. It's a huge technological leap where we're making stronger tools, whether it's for warfare, whether it's for farming, or for hunting. People also are able to specialize. They start focusing on different types of work. If you're making these metal weapons, you're not farming. That's specialization. Because farmers can supply a lot of food for the population, and they don't need that many people to help them grow it, now other people are going to focus on other pursuits. Maybe it's religion. Maybe it is metalwork. Maybe you want to make shoes and hats. Maybe you want to train dolphins. That's a little later. But specialization just means that people can have different types of jobs. And this is the time of the earliest civilizations. So what is a civilization, you might ask? How is that different from a permanent settlement? Civilizations are similar because, you have people permanently settling together, but civilization speaks to the style of culture, and according to AP World History, you have to have 4 characteristics to be considered a civilization. Here they are. First, agriculture. You have to have agriculture. It's assumed you have water. But you have to have agriculture because that leads to a food surplus, right? We have extra food, which means we now have more people. You have to have a political organization or some sort of formal, long-lasting institution. You have to have law and order. Otherwise, your society is going to fall very fast. You have to have specialization. So again, people that are doing other types of jobs. And you also have to have writing, some sort of record keeping that's written, whether it's hieroglyphics, whether it is the Phoenician alphabet. You have to have that in order to record your history, communicate, trade, and have law and order. This one actually gets a little bit controversial when you look at some societies that practice memorizing their history with storytellers, for instance, rather than writing it down. So there's a little bit of debate on that with historians. An example, the first known system of writing we have is cuneiform. You can see that back here. Okay, so let's talk about our 4 river valley civilizations. The first, Tigris and Euphrates. We usually call this one Mesopotamia, so if you want to call it Mesopotamia, go for it. It's a cooler sounding name. This one, the date's about 4000 to 3500 BCE. Just to clarify, BCE means before Common Era, which means before the year 0. So that's why it goes 4000 to 3500, is that it's trying to get closer to the year 0. Once you get to the year 0, then the numbers start going up. So it's like a math number line, if you want to think of it that way. This one is located in modern-day Iraq. Earliest known example of a human civilization, which makes sense. They make up the Fertile Crescent, so makes sense they'd be there. They have complex religious beliefs. You can see this in their stories. They have stories about floods. They have shrines and towers that they build called ziggurats to their gods. So you see it in their architecture as well. And they're highly organized into a city-state sort of group. City-states are like independent, independently governed, yet usually you're organized, you're connected by one common theme. So actually, if you think about it, the Greek word for city-state is polis. So a good example would be Indianapolis, because we are a city-state of Indiana. So think of it that way, like you've got a state, you're all connected by something that's common with all of you, but you have all these tiny little cities that maybe also have their own law code. Within those city-states, you have extreme social stratification. What that means is that you have a hierarchy of sorts. Kings and nobles are going to be at the top. You have peasants and farmers at the bottom. So there are people with power and people that have less power. That's social stratification. The government also becomes more complex. You start to have people that are divine kings. So they're known as god kings. And they have a complex law code called the Code of Hammurabi that we're going to look at next week. This, by the way, is where you get eye for an eye, if you're trying to think, wait, I've heard of that. The next river valley civilization that we'll look at is called the Nile River Valley. The Nile River Valley most people have heard of because they've heard of the pharaohs. This one takes place in 3000 BCE in northern Africa, which is modern-day Egypt, that section. They were ruled by a pharaoh, which is also considered a god king. The difference between their god king and the god kings of Mesopotamia is that the god kings of Mesopotamia are typically seen as like divine kings chosen by gods. Pharaohs are actually seen as like sons of God, like they are gods themselves. So that's part of their religious political ritual. They are polytheistic. They believe in multiple gods. Most of these groups do. They have a theocracy, just like the last one. But again, they believe that their leaders are gods themselves. They also have the development of writing. They have hieroglyphics, which are a little bit more sophisticated or a little bit more technical than the cuneiform we looked at before. And they use papyrus to actually make their own style of paper. The Indus River Valley is another one that we'll look at here. With the Indus River Valley, it's located in modern-day Pakistan, so today kind of in South Asia near India. This one started in 2500 BCE, so it's a little bit younger. It was known for its advanced grid-like cities. So if you think about how Indianapolis is set up, or even New York for that matter, how you have roads that they make squares, it's a grid-like pattern. They actually had the same thing. They also had their own running water system. The Indus River Valley develops independently, even though it has trade with some other groups. What that means is that while they traded, they still remained sort of isolated, trying to create their own specific culture. They were thought to be a theocracy, and their religion was thought to be a precursor to Hinduism. But we really don't know that much about them. We're learning more, but their system of writing was never translated. So this over here could be a shopping list, it could be a prediction, it could be an early copy of Harry Potter, nobody knows. And so we're not really sure why they disappeared either. Why did they leave all this behind? Did they get invaded a lot? Did they have issues with their environment that caused their agriculture to go away? We are not sure. The last one we'll talk about is the Yellow River Valley. The Yellow River Valley is located in China. It began around 2000 BCE. This one develops independently, mostly because of its geography. People don't think about this, but China actually has the Gobi Desert, they've got mountain ranges, and they have oceans, so a little bit more difficult to trade since we don't already have maritime routes and established trade routes. They're early pioneers in science. They also make their own weapons and tools. They actually use iron pretty early. And their religious beliefs are based around their ideas of spirits, centered around ancestor veneration, which will lead into Confucianism, which we'll talk about even more in depth next week. Their social classes help organize and govern their society. We actually start to see something called feudalism, which you'll learn about also in Japan and in medieval Europe, where you have the nobles owning the land and the peasants working it for them. But this is actually going to give way to their own unique dynasty system that we'll talk about as we talk about classical China. That is it for today. Of course, feel free to go back and pause if you need to look at any of the slides. Please answer your challenge questions, and hope you have a great day.